Welcome to Nutmeg Chatter. I'm J. Timothy Quirk. Over a decade ago, a small church on Barber Street in Torrington was transformed into a majestic and beautiful cathedral to the performing arts and was renamed Studio 59. The force behind that change was the renowned composer and performer Timothy Alexander Wallace. Dubbed the Mozart of Litchfield Hills, Wallace takes center stage at the grand piano during his concerts, performing classical and contemporary and improvisational compositions to critical acclaim. Timothy Alexander Wallace is in studio today, so it's time to have a chat with Timothy Alexander Wallace here on Nutmeg Chatter. Welcome to Nutmeg Chatter. I'm J. Timothy Quirk. Timothy Alexander, thank you for being here on Nutmeg Chatter here at WAPJ.
Thank you. This is a pleasure.
It's so great to talk to you here. I'm a fan of your work, and your Studio 59 on Barber Street is just a beautiful venue for all classical music performances.
Oh, and more than just classical. I mean, when I started the venue 10 years ago, it was strictly classical, and then began to expand to include, jazz, singer-songwriters. I've had one-act plays there. I've had poetry readings, which I call poetry circles, like
Very nice.
like
Yeah,
drumming circles, which I've also had.
sure.
I've featured visual artists as well in conjunction with music. Geez, there's so many things. Multimedia productions. So it's not just walking in and it's just classical music. You never, well, everything is planned out, so you just have to keep, focused to the website.
Certainly. And also, you had Katie Catt recently
Yep.
there who performed opera and artistic songs, the Dvorak's love songs.
Correct. Right.
So that's fantastic. And you will be performing on April 22nd. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Right. Absolutely. All Rachmaninoff.
Rachmaninoff. Tell me about that particular show that's going to be coming up.
Well, of course, Rachmaninoff was one of the greatest piano virtuosos of the 20th century, and also a great composer. So it takes a great pianist to compose virtuosic music for the instrument. So the music of Rachmaninoff that I'm featuring are specifically preludes and etudes.
Preludes and etudes, could you please, for our listening audience, could you describe what those terms mean?
Well, prelude, I guess stereotypically indicates music that occurs before and maybe a longer production of some sort,
Mm-hmm.
or they can just stand on their own.
Okay.
Okay. Etudes are studies. Now, a lot of etudes are not really fit, shall we say, for quote public performance because they're technical studies. Going back to Frederick Chopin, he wrote etudes, which are certainly concert worthy. I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
they're not only great exercises for the fingers, but musically speaking, they captivate. Um, and in fact, with Rachmaninoff, he didn't call his etudes simply just etudes. He called them etude tableau, meaning
Interesting.
that they paint a picture. And he was uh, purposely a little vague in terms of what inspired him. I mean, there are a number of composers who played music or composed music that was, I guess you could describe as program music. So that the music is trying to portray whatever it happens to be, whether it be a painting, perhaps it was a poem. Lots of examples of composers who use poetry as inspiration. So these etudes are painting pictures. Rachmaninoff, you might say, painted in sound
Very nice.
because they are soundscapes that just you can't even believe what you're hearing. And as much as I have played these, every single time I'm astonished.
Really, and you feel that inspiration, you feel that
Sure, absolutely.
electricity,
Oh,
and
they're electric, all right.
how did you discover Rachmaninoff in your history?
Oh, geez, that goes back to when I was a teenager. I mean, geez, I was exploring all composers, and
Hmm.
Rachmaninoff is for any pianist is a must.
Okay, yeah,
Okay, so but it goes way beyond that. It's something that has to captivate, the individual.
sure.
You know, uh, um, at that point, perhaps an aspiring artist, and that's always been with me, always.
Very nice. Now you create compositions and you also improvise on the piano as
Correct.
well.
Right.
Where do you find your inspiration?
Oh, geez, that's something so deep within I couldn't even explain it. I will say though, in terms of my quote history, um, I was improvising at the piano probably by the age of 7, 8.
Really?
Uh, and here's something very interesting. I have three older sisters who all studied the piano. And why my parents, they've never really given me an explanation why they never had me to study at that point. So I didn't really start you know, studying until I was almost 9,
Really?
which is very late. Because if you look at most um, professional pianists, certainly those that are, internationally known, most of them started by the time they were 3 or 4, or at the latest 5.
Really?
Oh
But
yeah.
from your perspective, you started later in life, and
Hmm.
yet this is something
Hmm.
that now is something that defines you
Oh,
as
absolutely. I still improvise today.
wow.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, I described in the introduction uh, the the phrase "the Mozart of Litchfield Hills,"
Hmm.
and when you described as at a very young age
Hmm.
performing and creating, that seems to apply. I know that that's not something that's not a term that you selected for yourself, but it's something that was placed upon you.
Yeah, it was right. It was some article. I don't even remember the paper that coined that term.
Sure.
Um, there was also, although I don't think this was actually published, but I do remember there was an editor of a paper. I think this was when the first year of the studio operating. I was described as a pioneer, and I thought, okay, and now I understand.
Pioneer. Tell me about it. Tell me more about being a pioneer.
Well, it's a pioneer in quote this neck of the woods.
Okay. Well, because what you're doing is you are taking this wonderful music, this wonderful the wonderful music, and
Hmm.
you are providing that to our community, which we are very grateful
Hmm.
because it is such an amazing opportunity to be able
Hmm.
to have somebody of your caliber
Hmm.
of performance to be able to perform for our Torrington listeners, for our
Hmm.
Torrington audience. So
Hmm.
thank you.
You're welcome.
What interests you today? I know that you're performing Rachmaninoff on April 22nd.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, what was the time of that performance?
It's 8 p.m.
8 p.m. at Studio 59, which is 59 Barber Street in
Hmm.
Torrington,
Hmm.
Connecticut. Now, but what are some of the things that inspires you today?
Ooh, you mean musically or for
Music,
the studio or?
musically, or if you can take that any way that you'd like. If
Okay,
for
well, gosh, that's a pretty wide open door there. Well, I could tell you this. This is within the last 3 to 4 months, especially. Um, and it's a piece of music. Talking about inspiration.
certainly.
A piece of music which I have always loved dearly, but there was just something in the last 3 or 4 months that love increased almost exponentially, and that is Stravinsky's Rite of Spring.
Wow. Okay.
And for some people who are not so accustomed to, ooh, it's not avant-garde. At the time, it was actually when it premiered in Paris. I forget the actual year, but early 1900s in Paris. It created a riot, and the composer had to flee the theater. Seriously. Now, what's fascinating is that I came across an article which is a study of what happened.
Hmm.
And apparently, because of the um, irregular rhythms, the very tense and dissonant harmonies, etc., it created a uh, sort of chemical reaction within the brains of people who had never heard something like that. And literally, they couldn't help themselves.
Wow.
Now, what's interesting is that a year later, the same people heard it again and just adored it.
Because
It,
they,
it took that year
right.
for their brains to accustomize, I guess, to the sound of it.
Sure.
There were even saying, because it was really a ballet. Some were saying it was the ballet. It was a reaction against, the kind of dance that it was. Probably both. But that piece of music um, changed music forever.
Wow.
Of course, if you look back at the history of music itself, it was just a chain of events, different compositions leading up to it, and which has always been the case. But I think this was considered rather dramatic and drastic because it really just changed the landscape immensely.
That's amazing. Well, speaking of ballet, when we come back from a break, we're going to talk about your history as a musician,
Hmm.
and ballet does factor into it a little bit
Hmm.
in terms of how you came here to Torrington. So we're going to come back. We're going to talk a little bit more with Timothy Alexander Wallace here on Nutmeg Chatter. Welcome back to Nutmeg Chatter. I'm J. Timothy Quirk. Here in studio is Timothy Alexander Wallace. We're talking about his work. We're talking about Studio 59. It's at 59 Barber Street in Torrington. Right before the break, we were talking about ballet, and we were talking just a little bit, and how
Hmm.
there is this amazing performance that created such a visceral reaction for listeners that a riot created, and yet a year later, their ears became acclimated to that same sound, and became a transcendent point in musical history. And part of it was because of the music that was expected for a ballet at that time. And I think with that in mind, I'd like to ask you, how did you come to Torrington? Because you are not a Torrington native, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Where were you born?
I was born in Texas,
You were born in Texas.
third generation Texan.
All right, nice. But you've been in Torrington for well over a decade
Oh
because
yeah, 12 years at least
uh,
at this point. Although I did not move to Connecticut from Texas.
tell me your history if you would be so kind.
I actually lived in Maine for a number of years. Sometimes it was off and on. Um, that history, which actually is very poignant to why I even created Studio 59. This goes back to the 80s when I met the owner of a music museum in Wiscasset, Maine, called the Musical Wonder House. Uh, the gentleman who owned that museum also had a retail location in Dallas, Texas, which I'm in from that area. So he discovered I was a pianist, and then he invited me to rekindle a candlelight concert series at the museum. This gentleman was from Austria originally, and his family of musicians, opera singers, concert pianists, composers. His grandfather was the court composer for Franz Ferdinand of Austria.
Really?
Hmm.
Wow.
So he had an aunt from Vienna who was a concert pianist. So she would come over and they would do these candlelight concerts.
Hmm.
When she passed away, they discontinued the series. So that's why he wanted to rekindle them. So I went up and it was transformative for me personally. It was like stepping back in time, but in multiple time frames because of the history of the instruments that were in the collection.
Hmm.
So from the 18th century all the way up to the 20th century. Um, And in doing that, it inspired me to one day have my own venue. Um, Over the years that I was in Maine, I looked. Well, this is small world that it is. I looked at least a half dozen old churches to try to make that happen, and it just didn't happen.
Hmm.
And here it happened in Torrington. Now I obviously did not move here to start the studio. That wasn't the intent. I was hired as the principal accompanist for Nutmeg Ballet. And then I discovered the church, I guess it was about 3 years later. And so that's the history.
Very nice. When you described Candlelight concert
Hmm.
series in Vienna, the Studio 59, for those who haven't been there, and if you haven't been there, you should go so you could see it and enjoy a performance there. There is this salon uh, feel that's very warm and very inviting. The seating
Hmm.
arrangements is very, very comfortable, and it's not. Yeah, I would say in a traditional sense,
Hmm.
where they're like lined seats or
That's
something.
correct.
Instead, it's very comfortable, where there's not a bad seat in the house
That's
because
correct.
everybody can see the center stage in that performance, but you're enjoying this actually it's, I should say luxuriating, if you will, in these very comfortable uh, period seats, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is a recreation of the European salon. Historically, um, before concert halls were invented, most people don't really consider that concert halls did not exist in certainly the 15th, 16th, 17th, and even 18th century.
Hmm.
Which of course changed everything. So music was heard in these salons, along with a lot of other things too. I mean, it was an era of exploration, not only of musical ideas, but all kinds of ideas. If you look at mm, Paris in the late 18th century, in the salons, you had intellectuals speaking, and actually, it was one of the ways that information was passed on that
Hmm.
helped to create the French Revolution.
That makes sense because it's a very intimate setting, and yet you can reach a large audience. I should say large audience comparatively for its time. Not like a
It's not gigantic.
not
It is
gigantic,
not
but
gigantic. Yeah, actually, seating is only for 45. Certainly, I mean, if I had different kinds of seats in there, I could get a lot more in. I wanted to avoid the quote stereotypical, recital hall setup or concert hall where you've got lines of chairs and so forth, and you have a stage area, yada yada yada. A lot of times, especially recital halls, tend to be rather sterile. And when the concert is completed, people get up and they leave. Not at Studio 59. That doesn't happen. Actually, I have a number of people that stay and they're talking about all kinds of things,
mm-hmm.
the music, the instruments, etc., whatever. Uh, so so the musical events are more than a musical event. They are a cultural one.
You said that when you were looking for a venue,
Hmm.
you were looking for a church to then transform
Hmm.
into that particular venue.
Hmm.
Would that be because of the size of the ceiling and the way that the sound hits it? Because that's something that I recognize
Right.
being in Studio 59.
Right. Yeah, that's part of it. But that's a little bit more involved than just that. I mean, it wasn't like I was looking for that.
Hmm.
Okay. It happened to be the last place I happened to discover. But before that, what had inspired me actually goes back to Nutmeg, the space that they originally began their history, which was over on Water Street, up on the third floor. I
That's
forget
right.
the street number 21 or whatever it was. Great space. So I had pursued that particular space, and that fell through because in order to have a venue for the public to attend, legal requirements of having an elevator, and the people who owned
Yeah.
the building at that time would not do it. So it killed the whole situation. After that, I looked at more space than you can shake a stick at. Oh my gosh, I have looked at more space in Torrington than you would could imagine. And so I happened to come across it was a small little ad, terrible photograph of this building. And I thought, well, I should go take a look at it at least. And so I did. And I thought, oh boy, here we go. So that's what happened, actually. Obviously, the height of the ceiling, 16-foot ceilings, which is a barrel vaulted ceiling. I just want to talk about that a little bit.
Please, please.
Um, Certainly, the ambiance of the space is just incredible. And by the way, when I moved into that space, the first piece of furniture I moved in there was this piano. It was so exquisite without any furnishings and just a piano. I didn't want to move anything into it. I didn't. It was just
Yep.
gorgeous. Okay, so here in terms of acoustics, you've got a 16-foot barrel vaulted ceiling, plaster walls, which is one of the best surfaces for sound, an old wooden floor. Uh, so there's a number of things that affect acoustics, dimensions, proportions, etc. And I'm sure when they built this church, they had none of that in mind. They happened to hit it just right. Seriously. And a funny story is this was my piano technician at the time. When he first came in, he said, "Oh, a little Carnegie Hall here." What's interesting, the dimensions of the room are about the actual same dimensions of the stage
Really?
of Carnegie Hall, without, of course, all the balconies. And I thought about, well, maybe I should put some balcony, which is possible, but probably not very feasible.
That's fantastic. Well, when we come back, we're going to continue our discussion and actually conclude our discussion. I'd like to talk about some of the other types of programs that occur
Sure.
at Studio 59, and then I want to follow back and continue our discussion about the Rachmaninoff concert that
Okay.
is going to occur on April 22nd. So we're going to be back in just a few moments on Nutmeg Chatter with Timothy Alexander Wallace. We'll be back just after this. Welcome back to Nutmeg Chatter. I'm J. Timothy Quirk. In studio here in Torrington, WAPJ Studios, is Timothy Alexander Wallace. We've been talking about his upcoming performance on April 22nd, where he will be performing some Rachmaninoff. We've been talking about Studio 59, and actually in the last segment we were talking about some of the dimensions of the space that makes that venue so, not just so inviting, but also just the sound really is elevated to another level. I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of the other programs that occur at Studio 59,
Mhm.
and if somebody is interested in booking that particular venue, how does that happen?
Okay. Well, in terms of the variety of programming, certainly there's going to be a lot of classical.
Hmm.
I've had jazz groups ranging from duets to when I had Mario Pavone here. I had a nine-piece band, and I told Mario when he booked the space, I don't know if I can have enough room to fit nine musicians. He said, "We'll make it work," and they did.
Yeah.
So, which was remarkable. One of the interesting aspects of this space is no matter the size of the group that's performing,
Hmm.
um, it takes it. It's never too much.
Yeah.
Ever. I don't know. It's just one of those anomalies, I guess. I'm not sure. I've had a brass quintet there more than once, which is a pretty strong sound.
Sure.
Awesome in that space. Just awesome. Really. So, I started adding in the jazz components, and I've had singer-songwriters there, poetry readings, drumming circles, multimedia shows. What I mean by that is I have a way to project images on the wall behind the piano or even onto the ceiling. So a good
Hmm.
example of that, and I've done these maybe 3 or 4 times. I call them concerts under the stars. If anyone is familiar with the Hubble telescope website, there
Hmm.
are hundreds and hundreds of images of deep space, and they're all phenomenal. They're almost mind-bending, surreal.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Those images are all copyright free. So the first time I did one, I had two other musicians I collaborated with, and we chose somewhere between 70, 80, and 80 different images. Then we decided to have the images in a sequence that would tell a story, but we didn't tell
Interesting.
the audience what the story was, and they all got it at the end.
Wow.
So if you can imagine all of these incredible images on the ceiling above you, and this music, which actually is, and it was all improvised, inspired by the images as they're progressing. It's just a wonderful experience. I can't describe it. Interesting enough, related to that, I think this is it's either Arizona or New Mexico, observatories where they or planetariums actually, excuse me, where
Hmm.
they project images of stars and constellations, et cetera, et cetera. There are some places which are hiring musicians and even composers to write specific music,
I can believe that.
and they're holding 2 to 4 concerts per day, and they're selling out.
I can see that. I can
It's
see the interest
just
in that. Yeah.
otherworldly. It's wonderful, really wonderful. So.
How do you pick those particular performances for that show, or how do people find you? What's the best way if somebody has that type of idea in mind and they want to? Um,
Like you just can contact me directly through the studio number. Go to the website studio59live.com, and just there's a way to contact me that way. So in regards to that, the space is available for musicians who want to book it on their own, or they can do a collaboration with me under the Studio 59 brand name. So there's a number of different ways that that can happen. I've had people also to book the space for private events, parties, for example. I had the Rotary Club booked the space for a Christmas party once, and they catered it and so forth. So it's an awesome space for a party.
that that it is. That it is. The website there for those interested is www.studio59live.com. And there's also a Facebook page, correct?
Yeah, Studio 59 Live Arts.
Excellent, excellent. Well, as we wrap up our conversation with you, in terms of the Rachmaninoff concert, which is
Mhm.
going to occur on April 22nd at 8 p.m. For tickets and for more information, they can go to that website.
Mhm.
Can they pre-order their tickets on the website
Actually, just to make reservations,
to make?
so they will need to actually make a phone call for that to happen, and so they can book their seat in advance and just pick up the tickets at the door.
Okay, and the phone number, if I can share
Sure,
it,
sure.
that would be the 860-482-6801.
Correct.
And so that way they can reserve their space because
Mhm.
seating is, as I said, there is no bad seat at this location. It's a very special and unique venue, and but because that is the case, the seating should be, you should get your tickets right away.
Yeah,
Or
because I mean, I can only seat 45 people. Although I've had more for other performances where I actually went out and bought more chairs. I had people sitting on the floor. I had them standing. It was standing room only.
wow,
That's happened more than once.
that
I wish it would happen more often, but
That I can believe. That well, Timothy Alexander Wallace, it has been a true pleasure and honor to have you here in the studio. I hope that people find out more information about your work. I hope that people find out more about the venue. And this is going to be a great year for Studio 59. Look for www.studio59live.com. This has been Nutmeg Chatter. I'm J. Timothy Quirk. Some music has been provided by the Jingle Punks, courtesy of YouTube royalty-free music, so we thank them for that. This has been a production of WAPJ Torrington Community Radio. We want to thank our guest, Timothy Alexander Wallace, for coming into the studio today. Thank you for having our chat on Nutmeg Chatter.